Welcome, everyone. Did everybody get a place to sit and something to eat and drink? Welcome to our conference on understanding stability and change in the gender-segregated labor market. I'm very happy to see all of you here. This is the closing conference for the project Gender Segregation in the Labor Market, Comparative Perspectives and Welfare State Challenges, that is financed by the VAM program of the Norwegian Research Council. And the conference is organized in collaboration with CORE, Center for Research on Gender Equality at the Institute for Social Research. The event is being streamed, so welcome also to those of you who are following us via the internet. My name is Liza Reisel, and I'm the research director for the research group on equality, integration, and migration at the Institute for Social Research. And I've been heading the project, which we've been working on for the last 5 years or so. I'll tell you more about the project in a minute, but I thought I'd start this introduction by giving a short overview of the topic of gender segregation, what it is, why it's important, and what the main patterns are in the Norwegian labor market today. When we talk about gender segregation, we typically talk about two different types of patterns. In the research literature, these are referred to as vertical segregation and horizontal segregation. Vertical segregation is about the distribution of men and women in the hierarchy of positions in the labor market, where men typically dominate in managerial positions and the highest paid positions. Horizontal segregation refers to a different pattern, which is that women and men typically work in different sectors, different occupations, and different industries. These two types of segregation are, of course, closely related, but as we will see throughout this conference, they are associated with different mechanisms and explanations. The reason why we might worry about gender segregation is that it has a number of negative consequences, both at the individual and at the societal level. Gender segregation is a significant explanation for the gender gap in wages and gender gaps in career opportunities. It creates less flexibility in the labor market and can create recruitment challenges in high-demand sectors. And it contributes to the perpetuation of stereotypes and constrained life choices for both women and men. And we'll come back to why this is later today. This is one of the reasons that the current Norwegian government has announced that they will work towards a strategy for a more gender equal education and labor market. So, what does vertical and horizontal segregation look like in today's Norwegian labor market? When we look at the top positions in the Norwegian labor market, we see that men dominate in most sectors, except civil society organizations. This is here. It's not shown here, but I thought I'd add that in the Norwegian Parliament, the share of women is about 40%, and since the late 1980s, it's been quite common that about half of the ministers are women as well. However, less than 30% of the top positions in business and in academia are held by women. If we zoom in on the business sector, this is the number of top managers in the medium to large companies. But if we turn to the largest companies in Norway, the share of women chief executives is much smaller at only 10%. It's not so easy to see here, but that's the number. Now, let's take a look at horizontal segregation. Most occupations in the Norwegian labor market are dominated by one gender. Only 15% of occupations are gender balanced, in the sense that they have between 40 and 60% of both occupations, of both genders, sorry. The rest of the labor market is fairly evenly divided between male-dominated and female-dominated occupations. However, male and female-dominated occupations are of slightly different character. This graph shows occupations by size and female share. The circles indicate the size of the occupations, and the further up the graph is the share of female will be higher. What we see here then is that there are some really large female-dominated occupations, and we don't see the same sized occupations that are male-dominated. Among these very large occupations, we find core occupations within healthcare, childcare, and education. So if we want to see changes to the overall segregation in the Norwegian labor market, these are clearly the occupations where change would make a really big difference. Finally, one of my favorite graphs from our project, which you can also find in the folders that are on your tables. This shows gender segregation, how it changes across the life course and across generations. I know there's a lot of stuff going on here, but I'll try to explain what you see. The main pattern, which is this curve, is the change across the life course. So among the people in their early 20s, that's here, segregation is high because individuals with vocational education enter the labor market first, and these occupations are highly segregated. Among people in their late 20s, gender segregation decreases when young people with higher education enter the labor market. And then from age 30, gender segregation increases. And one explanation can be that this, for many, is the period where important career choices and family formation coincide with consequences for labor market trajectories. And then when people are in their 40s, gender segregation increases, also after the period where people typically have small children. And this could indicate that early career choices have long-term effects. At the same time, this graph shows change across generations in the level of labor market segregation. So each colored line belongs to people born in different decades. So the green line shows gender segregation among those born in the 1940s and 1950s. That's this one. And then this dark gray line shows gender segregation for those born in the 1960s. And the light blue were born in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s, etc. So what this shows is how occupational gender segregation increases across the life course, but at the same time, the level of segregation decreases for each generation. So how can we understand these patterns? Well, that's where our project comes in. The goal of the project has been to investigate the mechanisms that contribute to gender differences in educational choices and what happens in the transition from education to work, and what processes are at work in the labor market that contribute to differences in men and women's careers and wages after labor market entry. In order to understand the Norwegian labor market better, we've also compared Norway to other countries. We've used a number of different data sources in order to answer the questions that we've had. Some questions have been answered through existing survey data, some through Norwegian registry data, and others by collecting new data through surveys and qualitative interviews. The project has been carried out by a multidisciplinary team of sociologists, economists, and political scientists. And the project group has consisted of researchers from the Institute for Social Research with collaborators from the University of Oslo, the University of California, San Diego, Boston University, Wellesley College, and the University of Basel in Switzerland. The project has had four main parts. Cross-national comparisons to investigate how different institutional contexts affect the ways in which men and women are differently placed in the labor market. Comparisons of career patterns in the United States and Norway, focusing on access to top positions, recruitment procedures, and decision-making. Girls' and boys' academic achievement, attitudes towards male and female-dominated educational programs, and consequences for gendered educational and occupational choices in Norway. and finally, mechanisms that channel men and women into different positions in the Norwegian labor market over the life course. Most of the results from these sub-projects are or will soon be published in academic journal articles and book chapters. But we'll be sharing some of our findings with you today. And you can also find a brief summary of some of the main findings in the Norwegian language folders that are distributed on your table. So, about today, the program is as follows. In a minute, I'll introduce you to our first keynote speaker, Professor Maria Charles, and then we will present some of the findings from the project, and you'll hear a bit from each of the sub-projects that I just mentioned. Then we'll have a break with some coffee and baked goods before I'll give the stage to our second keynote speaker, Professor Mary Blair-Loy. And to conclude the afternoon, we'll have a panel conversation between the two keynote speakers and the Norwegian gender equality expert Marit Heigen about some of the big questions that are often raised in the public debate about gender segregation, and where they will also reflect on avenues and possibilities for change. There will be time for questions and comments from the audience, to the panel, but also to the other speakers that you'll be hearing. So if you have questions to some of the other speakers, you can note them down during the afternoon, and we'll take them at the end as well. So, without further ado, I will introduce you to our first keynote speaker. Maria Charles is, Maria Charles is Professor of Sociology and Director of the Broome Center for Demography at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on gender inequalities around the world, and more specifically, the cultural and structural forces that sustain gender inequalities in families, education systems, and labor markets. She's published extensively on the topic of gender segregation in education and the labor market. And her award-winning book, Occupational Ghettos, The Worldwide Segregation of Women and Men, as well as a number of journal articles, have made major contributions to the field. And her research has been important to me and to our research team, and we're very delighted to have her here for this conference. More recently, she has centered her research on the ideological and organizational factors that contribute to women's underrepresentation in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the so-called STEM fields. And this is also the topic of our talk here today, entitled Manly Sciences, Gender Segregation of STEM, and What to Do About It. Please. Let's see. Get it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank Lisa and the whole team for inviting me. I'm going to talk today about give you today a summary of my research and research that's been conducted by others on gender segregation, with particular focus on gender inequalities in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Do you use that acronym here? Okay. Okay, gender equality is typically depicted as a one-dimensional entity. We often reference women's status as if its diverse indicators move together on a single continuum, increasing or decreasing depending on the level of patriarchy or the level of gender egalitarianism that characterizes a particular time or place. We also imagine that more affluent or modern societies will be more gender equal. I call this an evolutionary account of women's status, and it does hold much truth. Gender equality has increased steadily on many important indicators, first in the affluent West, and then around the globe. Examples can be found in the nearly worldwide extension of equal citizenship and voting rights, and in the dramatic increases in women's educational attainment and labor force participation that occurred during the second half of the 20th century. But let me see if I can change this. This is not the whole story, as you know. On many measures, patterns of variation are strongly at odds with conventional modernization accounts. This is especially true with respect to many forms of occupational gender segregation, including in STEM fields. Norway, for example, is well known around the world for its family-friendly social policies, affluence, and high rates of women's employment. But within its labor markets and its universities, we find extreme gender segregation by occupation and fields of study, as Liza just mentioned. Norwegian women make up nearly 60% of university students, but are, as you can see here, heavily concentrated in social science, education, and health fields. Only a third of science students are women. This gender segregation by field of study translates into segregation in the professional labor market. Despite high employment rates, women made up only 23% of Norwegian engineers in 2018. In the United States, engineering is even more male-dominated. Only 15% of engineers are women. And, as can be seen here, these sorts of gender disparities are found across race, class, and citizenship categories in the United States. This extreme sex segregation of engineering and technical fields is found in most advanced industrial countries. But a broader cross-national comparison reveals important differences. And these differences follow a pattern that deviates substantially from the so-called evolutionary account of women's status. This chart from a 2009 paper shows, for example, less gender segregation of engineering programs in developing than in advanced industrial countries. More recent data show similarly surprising patterns. Women make up nearly half of engineering graduates in Indonesia today, and their representation is weakest in a collection of very affluent countries that includes the United States, Japan, and Switzerland. Evidence for modernization accounts is also weak if we look at computing fields. For example, according to new data from the International Labor Organization, women's representation in information technology occupations is weaker in Norway than it is in Ethiopia, Bulgaria, and Turkey. In the United States, women's share of computer science degrees actually decreased by 10 percentage points from 28% to 18% between 2000 and 2010. Indian women, by contrast, earn more than 40% of computer science bachelor's degrees in India. Most Westerners are surprised to learn that women's representation among science graduates is nearly 50% higher in some Muslim-majority countries than in Netherlands, for example. So I've been asked today to give a general overview of different sociological explanations for gender segregation and its variable patterns, including and to talk a little bit about my own contributions, which includes these two books. So let me start with a few observations. Many work tasks are culturally labeled as either masculine or feminine. All else equal, tasks involving nurturance or interpersonal relations are understood to be feminine in many or most societies. And tasks that involve physicality and assertiveness are understood to be masculine. In advanced industrial countries, many technical and abstract analytical tasks are also believed to be intrinsically masculine. And these understandings emerge early. When American school children, as early as kindergarten, are asked to draw a picture of an imaginary engineer, this is how it looks. Most depict a man, mostly a white man. And these taken for granted beliefs about natural incumbents of jobs are deeply embedded in our popular culture. Even Barbie has told young American girls that math is not something that they will enjoy or be good at. So I don't know if you had this here, but this was called Teen Talk Barbie, and you pull a string and she would say things. Did you have that here? Okay. Well, anyway, you pull the string and she had 10 or so things that she would say, and one of them she would say was, math class is tough. And another thing that she would say was, let's go shopping. Much more upbeat. So it's easy to understand why people would presume that gendered abilities and aspirations are hardwired and natural, especially if we consider how extremely gender segregated some occupations are. For example, if we compare engineers with childcare workers in terms of their gender composition. Comparative research suggests something different, however. We have seen that the gendering of fields varies a lot across countries, and it also varies a lot over time. And this contextual contingency of gender labeling and gender typing sets up a tension between gender determinist accounts of sex segregation and contextual explanations. And this tension runs throughout the social science literature, and it plays out in the relative emphasis placed on what are called micro and macro level explanations for gender segregation. So micro level explanations consider characteristics of persons, individual workers and employers, as central causal mechanisms in the production of inequality. And macro level explanations focus on characteristics of larger entities of the context, so organizational arrangements, policies, cultural belief systems. So micro-level accounts are often divided into what are called supply-side and demand-side explanations, depending on whether they focus on workers or employers. Supply-side accounts focus on differences between men and women workers. For example, gender segregation of engineering might be attributed to men's greater capacity for analytical reasoning or women's stronger orientation toward interpersonal relations or care. Biologically based accounts emphasize sex hormones and brain structures. Socialization accounts emphasize the sorting of people into binary sex categories at birth and the processes that support gender-conforming behaviors over the life course. Because gender traits are eventually internalized, we expect that adult women will prefer roles that draw upon feminine traits, and that adult men will prefer roles that draw on masculine traits. These supply-side explanations seem very straightforward, and they resonate widely. And this may be because they align very well with the ubiquitous Mars and Venus mythology that depicts men and women as innately opposite sexes, while being careful to point out that men and women are also entitled to equality and free choice. But these essentialist, different but equal, so this is a very common rhetoric, is the different but equal paradigm. These generate fierce resistance sometimes among advocates for gender equality because they seem to blame women for their lesser status and because they suggest that the current the current division of roles in the labor market and in families is inevitable. Most sociologists see supply-side explanations as inadequate because measurable differences between men and women are actually too small to account for the extreme patterns of segregation that we observe, and because the gender typing of occupational roles varies so much across time and space. Among supply-side traits, occupational aspirations show the most robust effects. Aspirations are strong predictors of career outcomes, and gender is a strong predictor of aspirations. But as I'll suggest, occupational aspirations are also social products. Demand-side explanations switch the focus from workers to employers or clients. The simplest demand-side explanation for gender segregation is that some employers simply have tastes for discrimination, and they're willing to pay more to hire members of preferred groups. Classical economic theory suggests that this form of discrimination will eventually fade away because it puts discriminating firms at a competitive disadvantage because they're paying more. So why does it persist? One explanation that's been offered by economists is called statistical discrimination theory. It suggests that discrimination persists because employers have imperfect information about the productivity of individual workers. They don't know how productive workers will be. And because they can't predict individual productivity, employers discriminate against groups whose members they believe are less productive on average, just on average. For example, if an employer believes that the average woman has weaker capacities for analytical reasoning than the average man, it might seem rational for them to discriminate against all women in hiring for jobs where analytical reasoning is very, very important. It is important to recognize that these beliefs need not be true to cause extreme gender segregation. If employers are exposed to a common set of stereotypes about men's and women's average capacities for analytical reasoning, statistical discrimination may be a powerful mechanism for the perpetuation of gender segregation. Discrimination is difficult to measure, in part because it's illegal, but experiments offer some compelling evidence. One showed that scientific papers were judged to be of higher quality when they were attributed to a man relative to a woman author. Another showed that women musicians were more likely to be hired for an orchestra when their gender was concealed by a screen during auditions. And as we'll see, as we'll hear about later today, Mary Blair-Loy has also collected video evidence of differential treatment in hiring. Knowledge or even rumors about this sort of discrimination may influence occupational aspirations, leading some girls to forego STEM training. So this is part of the reason why I say that aspirations are also a social product. This is important because opting out of STEM training will reduce girls' actual skill levels and reinforce stereotypes about intrinsic gender differences in aptitudes and interests. In this sense, supply and demand side processes may reinforce one another and generate powerful self-fulfilling prophecies. actions and aspirations of individual workers and employers develop within a broader social context. And this brings us to macro-level research on how social structures and cultural belief systems influence individual aspirations and outcomes. Structural analyses focus on the organization of societies and the rules that govern them. So earlier, I alluded to one particularly influential structural theory, which links socioeconomic modernization to increased gender equality. And here the argument is that, again, discrimination is too costly to sustain in competitive industrial economies and will therefore gradually sort of wither away. Evidence for modernization theory is mixed. As I mentioned, some forms of inequality decrease dramatically with economic development and others do not, like even gender segregation may actually increase. I have found, moreover, that it's not only STEM outcomes that become more gendered with societal affluence. STEM aspirations do as well. This chart shows that 8th grade boys and girls' aspirations for STEM work become less alike as countries get richer. So here, a ratio of 1 would mean gender parity. So as the bars get shorter, that means you're getting further away from gender parity. And you can see that in the more affluent countries, the bar is shorter. So it's not just that people are more able to indulge their gendered aspirations. So one argument might be, well, just in rich countries, women can do what they actually want to do everywhere, but they can now afford to do it. But it's not only that they're indulging their aspirations, it's that the aspirations themselves are becoming more gendered too. In other words, modernization may matter to women's status, but not in the simple across-the-board fashion that's suggested by evolutionary accounts. So what about social policies? STEM jobs are embedded in societies and workplaces with widely varying laws and organizational arrangements. Among other things, different government and organizational policies may make combining work and family obligations more or less difficult. In the United States, policies for family leave or flexible scheduling are less well developed than they are in many European societies. But even when they are available, the masculine cultures in many STEM workplaces, including in Scandinavia, have been shown to discourage both men and women from using these provisions for fear of stigma. So this brings us to culture. Stereotypes are important macro-level factors contributing to occupational gender segregation. These operate by reinforcing cultural beliefs about the intrinsic masculinity or femininity of persons and work tasks. Highly segregated occupations are widely believed to require aptitudes that map neatly onto the Mars and Venus gender dichotomy that I mentioned earlier. Cultural stereotyping reproduces gender segregation through diverse processes. First, they induce people to make gender-conforming choices, either to affirm one's masculinity or femininity, or to avoid uncomfortable work environments. Second, stereotypes may reproduce segregation by causing discrimination against gender non-conforming applicants. So women in STEM report experiencing more discrimination than women in other fields. And experimental studies corroborate these reports. Third, cultural stereotypes support gender segregation by shaping people's identities in stereotype-consistent directions. They bias our assessments of our own abilities, our own aptitudes. So experimental studies show that telling people falsely that members of their group tend to do worse on a task causes them to rate their own performances lower on that task and to express less interest in a related career. So if you tell women, for example, that some random task that's just made up, that men do better on it than women, women will do worse on it than if they're not told that. And they will also express less interest in pursuing a career that involves whatever skill the experimenters have made up. Another study showed that stereotypes about women's lesser math ability make women more likely than men students to attribute a bad grade in math and mathematics to a lack of intrinsic ability, and therefore more likely to drop out of STEM degree programs. So there's evidence that if a woman student gets a bad grade on a test in a gender nonconforming field, that she will be more likely than her man counterparts to attribute that to a lack of intrinsic ability. Besides biasing understandings of our own ability, stereotypes can bias understandings of what we'll like, of affinity. So it can not only bias our understandings of our abilities, but it biases our beliefs about what we'll enjoy doing. People will expect to enjoy and therefore prefer work that involves gender-conforming tasks. And this is important. This effect is especially strong in affluent societies where people are exhorted by parents and teachers and each other and peers to follow their passions and do what they love in making life choices. I have argued that this self-expressive value system, the emphasis on self-realization, self-expression through our work and through our careers and through our educational choices, operates sort of as an invitation for the incursion of gender stereotypes into the formation of occupational aspirations. So in advanced industrial societies, we're told to follow our passions, do what we love, and this, I've argued, is sort of an invitation for a stronger influence of gender stereotypes in the formation of our aspirations. And for example, if adolescents often don't know in advance what they're going to love or be good at. So many draw upon stereotypes about what people like them love or are good at. And since gender is such a salient part of individual identity, that often means that they look to same-gendered persons for evidence on what they'll love and be good at. As a result, girls will expect to enjoy work that they think will be more people-oriented, more emotionally rewarding. And following these passions will probably not lead them toward the solitary science career that's depicted in Western popular culture. So widespread cultural beliefs about how men and women are different and about what men and women enjoy doing contribute to career choices that reproduce the gender order. The power and resilience of gender segregation in advanced industrial countries is partly due to the fact that these choices are experienced as the expression of likes and dislikes that are quintessentially individual, not the outcome of any coercive processes. So we experience these as individual choices. Curricular and career choices become acts of identity construction and come to represent much more than practical economic decisions in affluent societies. And fourth way that that stereotypes affect, support segregation is through their influence on our actual performance. So stereotypes affect performance in stereotype-consistent manners. Experiments on so-called stereotype threat show that people do worse on tests when they fear confirming a negative stereotype about their gender or their racial group. So in one study, a significant gender gap in test performance was observed when subjects were told, as I said, that men typically do better. Gender stereotypes are most powerful where gender composition is most skewed. So stereotype effects on women's performance will be largest in the most male-dominated fields. And this is another way in which stereotypes are self-fulfilling. So should we be concerned about gender segregation if this follows from choices made in the absence of overt coercion or discrimination? I've argued that this segregation is of more than academic interest for three reasons. First, separate but equal principles very often translate into separate but unequal outcomes. And we see this, for example, in the lower pay that's found in female-dominated occupations. Second, gender segregation has feedback effects, reinforcing stereotypes and limiting the perceived economic, educational, and family options of subsequent generations. And third, women and racial and ethnic minorities represent an untapped labor pool globally in fields like engineering and computer science, where shortages threaten to undermine national development or economic competitiveness. So if women's underrepresentation in male-dominated occupations is a problem, what can be done to change it? My research suggests that this change will not come easy, and it will partly depend on increasing girls' and women's interest in STEM and social support for pursuing STEM. And this will in turn depend on the gradual erosion of two kinds of cultural stereotypes: those that depict women as innately ill-suited for STEM work, and those that depict STEM work as uncreative, solitary, and masculine. Efforts toward this sort of counter-programming can be found in countless STEM diversification initiatives by governments, NGOs, and activists around the world. Counter-programming is also evident in the growing popularity of toys like Goldilocks, shown here, that resist the sort of so-called pink aisle marketing of toys. And toy role models can also be found in the form of Lego figures, complete with test tubes and dinosaur fossils. You'll notice these are women scientists. In the United States, we've also seen efforts to rebrand STEM as compatible with conventional femininity. So we have books like Kiss My Math and Algebra Exposed, which take on the male math nerd stereotype by depicting math as both feminine and fun. And with the rise of geek chic, we also see even Barbie has had a makeover. Computer Engineer Barbie was released in 2010, posing a sharp contrast to her teen talk sister from the 1990s. This new version comes decked out with a pink laptop and a tight t-shirt that's printed in binary code, essentially replacing one set of stereotypes with another. I've also suggested that a more aggressive strategy for reducing the salience of stereotypes would be to create more opportunities for girls and boys to learn directly about STEM fields. In the United States, students are able to opt out of math and science very early in the secondary program. I don't know how it is here. But expanding graduation requirements in STEM fields might decrease reliance on stereotypes and increase girls' confidence in their capacity to do this work and to enjoy it. And although such policies might seem to be at odds with ideals of individual choice and self-expression, Research suggests that they can weaken the penetration of gender stereotypes and reduce peer pressure in course taking. Comparative studies show, for example, that a larger share of STEM degrees go to women in countries where, and in US states, where high school requirements include STEM courses. This may be because reluctance to transgress gender stereotypes declines with age. So the earlier that kids have a choice, the more segregated those choices are likely to be. And or because exposing students to a broader array of fields provides them with better information about what they like and what they're good at. But early exposure may backfire without careful attention to the culture and organization of STEM classrooms and workspaces. Encouraging a sense of belonging for underrepresented groups requires work and study environments that include diverse role models, supportive peer networks, and freedom from gender stereotypes and discrimination. Even the physical environment can matter to girls' sense of belonging. One experiment showed that exposure to stereotype-consistent computer science classrooms, for example, with Star Trek posters and video games visible, decreased girls, but not boys, interest in studying computer science. Gender differences were smaller when subjects were exposed to gender-neutral classrooms, for example, with nature posters visible. So the clear conclusion from a large body of research is that individual occupational preferences are social products. One implication is that girls who aim to study what they love might be just as passionate about computer science and engineering as they are about teaching and nursing if they had more chances to find out whether they love these fields or not. And their passions might grow if they could more easily imagine themselves fitting in to these professional cultures. Counter-stereotype programming and more exposure of girls and women doing these gender nonconforming type of jobs might help make that leap of imagination. So that's it. Thank you.
We have a few moments for questions. If anybody wants to ask Maria any questions about what she just presented, you can also ask them in Norwegian and I can translate. Yes, Eivind.
My name is Eivind Hoffman.
Oh, just a second. You need a microphone because of the streaming.
My name is Eivind Hoffman. I'm a labor economist and statistician, retired. And my question is, why are health occupations, nurses and medical doctors, not considered as STEM occupations?
They generally are considered STEM occupations. Within STEM, there's a great diversity of occupations, and their gender compositions differ a great deal, as you know. And so doctors, medical doctors, would be considered STEM professionals. And we see within higher education that biology and chemistry, so the life sciences, are quite gender integrated. And the physical sciences, technical fields, engineering, computer science, are extremely gender segregated. And I think that has to do with the fact that, you know, many of the people that are studying biology and chemistry are in line for medical school, are preparing to go to medical school and become medical doctors. So it's not the case that all STEM fields are male-dominated. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, Annelise.
I have a question about the relationship between the degree of affluence of societies and the status of STEM or engineering. I just wonder, I mean, your main explanation is that this has to do with the ideology of choice that sort of has taken over as a kind of a driver. But I also think that it must have to do with I mean, what the opportunity structure, because I guess that the status of engineering will change with what are the alternatives in any society. And I think that, for instance, in Norway, you can see that in some immigrant groups, it's called ALE in Norwegian. It's engineering and becoming a lawyer and a doctor. That are the most popular or high status occupational choices among immigrants. So, and obviously that is sort of informed by their countries of origin. So I just wonder if this choice argument is a bit too simplistic.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I don't disagree with what you said. I think that people, and it's really about privilege. And so privileged people in any context are more likely to make choices that are seen as practical. And so we see that within the U.S. too. We see that the minority groups are more likely to choose fields of study that are seen as linked to career paths, whereas it's the very privileged people that choose the majors that are much more self-expressive and not linked to clear, and they can also afford to do so, because if they fail to get a job, they have some sort of backstop. So I think we're making the same point, that it's this privilege, this ability to make choices that are maybe not necessarily linked to high status occupations that allows people in affluent contexts to sort of follow passions. But given the lack of information, those passions are often going to be aligned with gender stereotypes, because most people don't really know exactly what they're going to love or be good at. And I think upper middle class girls are more able to make self-expressive choices because they don't imagine themselves also as breadwinners in the future, as sole breadwinners, whereas boys may be more likely to do that.
Any other questions?
All right.
Thank you very much. All right. So now we are, thank you, Maria. We are turning to sort of a relay race of findings from our project. We have 4 presenters that will show you sort of snapshots of things that we've been working on and results from the studies that we've done. And the first one out is Erling Barth. He's an economist and research professor at the Institute for Social Research. And his research expertise is on inequality in the wage structure, employment, the economics of the welfare state, and gender wage differences. In the project, Erling has contributed with studies on the gender wage gap with some of our international collaborators. And today he will talk about occupational gender segregation across countries and over time. Let's see. I will find it for you. Here. Yes.
Tack så. Okay, so thank you for this opportunity to present quickly the results from a study we have done within this project. So the title is Resolving the Gender Equality Paradox, and I'm going to talk about equality, occupational gender segregation across countries and over time. So there has been an observation that countries with high levels of female labor participation also had high levels of occupational gender segregation. And by occupational gender segregation, we basically mean that women do some jobs and men do other jobs. And that women tend to crowd into some occupations and men into other occupations. And this has been seen as quite a puzzle, actually, that as you increase the labor participation of women, the segregation actually goes up. And Maria Charles wrote an article in 1992, and she called it an empirical anomaly. And she did stress the size of the service sector, and she stressed also the incorporation of domestic tasks into the paid work, which we will talk more about. And then there was a paper by Mandel and Semyonov in 2006 who labeled this the welfare state paradox, because they actually linked this to the welfare states, or the Nordic countries, or the size of the welfare states. And they actually said that large welfare states tend to impede women's ability to compete. So that was a claim they argued in this article. So this seems a bit strange, and in the popular discussion, this has occurred as some kind of an equality paradox, that you get more equality of opportunities, and it looks like people choose more different. So the outcomes are not equal when the opportunities become more equal. So that's the key paradox that we're going to talk about. And in our paper, which is joint work with Liza Reisel and Kjersti Mische Østbakken, we use international data and compare gender segregation across occupations, across countries over time, and see how if these results that were observed 10 to 15 or 20 years ago still persist, and try to make some sense out of it. And we actually claim that we will resolve this equality paradox. So we use international data. We use the EU Silk for occupations. So we have data on occupations. We add data on homemakers. So we add staying at home, reporting that their main occupation or the main task is to take care of the family or to produce home production. We add that as an occupation. I'll return to that. And then we use the labor force service of Eurostat for their labor force participation numbers. And we add data from the US, from the CPS, and compare what has happened in the most recent decade. So we go from 2004 to 2014. And we have a few, or quite a lot of Eastern European countries who came in to EU Silk after 2009, so they are more recently observed. So our key findings, which I will say now, just in case we don't have time to go through everything, is that there seems to be an equality hurdle rather than an equality paradox in the labor market. So what I mean by that is that if you look at segregation in the labor market, if you look at countries where labor force participation is low, and you increase labor force participation, the level of segregation tends to increase. So it grows. And as you approach a higher level of labor force participation, this relationship disappears and it flattens. And when you come over the top and you increase labor force participation even further, the relationship switches to negative. So when we look at countries with a high level of labor force participation, increasing female labor participation tends to decrease segregation. And it's actually not the case anymore that the Nordic countries are highly segregated relative to other countries. So that's one key point. The other one is that the share of the public sector, if you look at countries or periods of time where the public sector is large, gender segregation is actually smaller. So it's not a positive relationship as the welfare state paradox claims. So that's for the welfare state paradox. And once we add homemaking to the tasks, so what I've been talking about now is gender segregation in the labor market, how men and women are distributed across occupations. But if we look at the segregation and we include homemakers, people who report that they are hjemmearbeidende as their main activity in the surveys, as one occupation, of course the level of segregation goes up. Why is that? Because there are all women who do this, who report that they have homework, that they have being homemakers as their main activity. And also, the increasing pattern between labor force participation and segregation disappears and becomes negative. So if we include all the tasks that we have to do, we also have to do these tasks. They are tasks that are to be done in the society. There's taking care, it's care and other tasks that are being done in the home. And if they are transformed into the labor market, if we include these tasks, the level of segregation goes up, but the correlation between labor force participation and segregation changes sign. So I'll show you this shortly. Okay. So let's first take a look at how the share of people who do who report that they do domestic tasks and care responsibilities as their main activity. So if we look at Italy, for instance, this is about 15%. The black part here is men, and the gray one is women. So these are people who report that they do that they are hjemmearbeidende as their main activity. And in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and a few other countries, this share is extremely small. So this is the average over the last decade in these countries. So let us now first take a look at gender segregation in the labor market. So there's a measure called the Duncan Index, which measures gender segregation, and it basically just measures how many people it's a thing that measures how many people you have to move around in order to get an equal distribution of men and women. So if you have a high number here, like 1, then everyone has to change a job in order to get a male and female equal distribution. And if you have 0, it is an equal distribution. And most countries are located around here. And what we found is that in 2004, we find Norway and Sweden and some other countries crowding in the middle here, not with a very high as we used to before. So we have gotten into the middle of the crowd. And we have seen a reduction in gender segregation in countries like Norway, Sweden, and the US. And we have seen, for instance, an increase in gender segregation in Italy, which had a low level in the first place in the labor market. So let's include homemaking into the segregation measure. And what we see now is, so now here in the labor market, we have Norway and Sweden and the US, more at the bottom of the segregation in 2014 than we had in 2004. If we now compare segregation when we include homemakers, what we see is that Norway, Sweden, and the US, Denmark, are all at a very low level or at the bottom in terms of gender segregation of tasks. And it's not really because we changed the position very much when we include homemakers, because it doesn't really matter that much if you include homemakers into to Norway and Sweden and so on. Why doesn't it matter? Because there are so few. But it matters a lot in the countries where there are many homemakers. So it matters a lot for Italy. Oops. So look at how Italy moves here. Jumps about up to here, from here. And we see that all the countries kind of move, except with the exception of Norway and Sweden, which stay put. So everyone is shifted to a more segregated position once you control for home making, which is not so strange. So that's just basically means that if you include all the types of jobs that we are done, the level of segregation is very low in the countries with a high labor force participation. So what I show you here is the relationship estimated with a regression analysis across in a panel of countries. And this shows you the predicted level of gender segregation as we increase female labor participation rate. So at low levels of female labor force participation rate, there is a lower level of gender segregation, and it increases in the labor market up to around slightly above 75% participation among females, and from there on it goes down. This is a predicted pattern across using a panel of countries. So what happens if we introduce homemaking as a task or an occupation that has to be, like taking care work and things? Then the level of segregation jumps up to the red line, and it jumps up much more, of course, at the low levels of labor force participation, because at low levels of labor force participation, there's much more husmødre who do who do care work and things like this at home. So, and then the pattern is now decreasing over time. So when we monetize or we pay for a lot of the work that is previously done at home, we also tend to reduce segregation in terms of tasks that are to be done. So that's basically our main story. Okay. So we do some more to validate this. We add country fixed effects, and we use only the variation within countries, and we get a very similar pattern when we do this over time. So we have the same equality hurdle when we control for idiosyncratic differences across countries. And when we add control for the size of the public sector, two things happen. One thing is nothing, which means that the equality hurdle is still there in the labor market. And the labor force, the pattern between segregation and labor force participation remains about the same as we had when we controlled for the public sector. And there is a negative correlation, conditional on labor force participation, between the size of the public sector and the level of segregation in the labor market. So it doesn't seem to be much of a welfare state paradox. Okay, so this is our key result in this part of the project when we compare across countries. Of course, so what we see here now is that there is, when we add the domestic tasks to the calculation, it kind of resolves this puzzle, and which is consistent with what was claimed in 1992, and segregation tend to increase as so what happens when you start out from a low level of labor force participation is that you domesticate, or the opposite, you incorporate tasks into the labor force, and segregation in the labor market increase. And then segregation decreases when the labor market attachment becomes sufficiently strong. And there is no welfare state paradox. And it appears that at least if we think about the measure where we include all the jobs that has to be done, then it looks like more equal opportunities also provide more equal outcomes. So that's the key message. Thank you.
We can take one or two questions now if anybody is very eager to ask Erling something. Annelise.
I just wonder if you included the home workers in the point you had about the size of the public sector and the relationship between the public sector and gender segregation, or was that only labor market positions?
We have done both.
Yeah.
So and the patterns are not that much affected. I mean, if we include the level of the public sector, it's still the case that we have a declining relationship between the labor force participation and segregation we have this hurdle in the labor market, and it's still the case that we have lower segregation with higher public sector, higher levels of higher share of public sector.
Anyone else? Ivan?
Sure.
Comment to your diagram on self-declared participation in household tasks by men and women. When we looked at this in the late 60s, early 70s, we found that husbands had a tendency to declare much larger participation in household tasks than wives.
Yeah, I don't know if I can't comment clearly on that. If you look at Norway, there's of course only a very small part here who does that now. So yeah, that's all I can say. Of course, there may be differences in how people answer this question across countries. If you have but this is the share of people, the share of the population who say that they do this, and you're only asked about this if you are in non-employment. And it's the people who are in non-employment who answer this question, and there may be some differences across countries that. But I don't see here that there is a majority of male men who does this in Norway.
Thank you very much. Then it's me. I've already introduced myself, so I'll just start presenting this part of the project, which has to do with gendered educational choices. Gendered educational choices are among the main drivers of gender segregation in the labor market. Using Norwegian registry data with information about the educational choices and the occupational destinations of the total population, we've calculated that 2/3 of the occupational gender segregation can be directly explained by segregated educational choices. At the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge, as Maria Charles already has been talking about, that the distribution of men and women in the labor market affects educational choices, because the adolescents and young adults who are making these choices are not making them in a vacuum, but relate to the world around them and the patterns that they see, where most occupations are dominated by one or the other gender. But in order to understand why young people continue to make gendered educational choices, the research literature broadly points to 3 types of explanations. The first one emphasizes norms and beliefs, and Maria Charles here has been one of the central scholars in developing this theoretical perspective. And the theory is that young people continue to choose in gendered ways because of the continuing widespread belief that men and women are innately different in ways that affect abilities and interests, with consequences for educational and occupational choices. And because this belief is common also in otherwise relatively gender-equal societies, horizontal gender segregation is not contested in the same way as many other gender equality issues. The other explanation emphasizes rational choice. Who has something to gain from making gender non-traditional choices? What are the costs and risks associated with choosing non-traditionally? Women, for example, have historically had more to gain from choosing male-dominated occupations than the other way around, because male-dominated occupations have had higher wages and higher status than female-dominated occupations. The third explanation, sorry, I was looking at the wrong chart here. The third explanation emphasizes opportunities and constraints. Many young people choose what is accessible and not necessarily what they most aspire to. Gender and social status contribute to constraining young people's choices. One such constraint could be that some occupations are so dominated by men or women that it becomes an unthinkable choice for the opposite sex. And another could be that they don't get good enough grades to be accepted to the educational program that they most wanted to attend. So in our studies, we've investigated how these 3 explanations, focusing on opportunities, beliefs, and rational choices, fit with the patterns we see in Norwegian young people's educational choices. Who are more likely to choose gender-typical or atypical in the Norwegian education system today? And how do the pupils think about who's best suited for which educational programs? And usually when we talk about gendered educational choices, we tend to talk about the share of women and the share of men in various study programs. So for example, we often say that about 12% of nursing students in Norway are women, about 20% of engineering students, the other way around. We often say that 12% of nursing students are men and about 20% of engineering students are women. Less often we talk about what share of women or men choose educational programs that are dominated by the opposite sex. Because most students choose gender-balanced or gender-typical educational programs, overall, in the whole education system, only about 5% of both girls and boys choose an educational program that is dominated by the opposite sex. So it's a relatively rare occurrence. In Norwegian upper secondary schools, most students choose gender-balanced programs, especially girls, which is the gray zone here. On top are the boys and on the bottom are the girls. And the biggest gender balanced program is, of course, the college preparatory program, studiespesialisering. And a much larger percentage of boys than girls choose vocational programs that are dominated by their own sex. So the ones that are dominated by their own sex is the one in green here. So these are the choices among the boys, and these are the choices among the girls. For boys, this is typically electricity and electronics, construction, and technical industrial production. And for girls, this is health, childhood and youth development, and design and crafts. In higher education, the pattern is opposite. Men are more likely to choose gender balanced, and women are more likely to choose female dominated. So these are men on top here, and their choice of programs that are gender balanced or same-sex dominated or opposite-sex dominated, and these are the women's choices. What stands out here, however, is that such a high share of men who enter higher education make non-traditional choices. This seems to go against what we already know from the literature about who's more likely to cross gender boundaries when they make educational choices. So, what happened? Well, first of all, the earlier literature emphasizes how women have made major inroads into male-dominated fields in higher education. So, most of these are now in the gray zone, such as business and administration and law. Some have also gone from male-dominated to female-dominated, such as psychology. Today, only the more hardcore STEM fields are male-dominated, such as information and computer technology and engineering. And if we set aside business and administration, which is by far the largest study program in Norwegian higher education, 4 out of the 5 largest study programs are female-dominated. That's nursing, kindergarten teacher, primary school teacher, and health education. So even though the share of men in these educational programs is relatively low, together these men make up a substantial share of the men who enter higher education. So does this mean that the pattern has changed and female-dominated fields have become more attractive than male-dominated fields in higher education? If we look at the grade point averages of those who enter the various types of educational programs, it seems that this is not exactly the case. I want to point out that in the brochures that you have, there's a mistake where these numbers at the bottom have percentages. These are the grade point averages, which is grunnskolepoeng in the Norwegian system, and not percentages. Anyways, so we looked at the grade point average at the end of lower secondary school among the students who choose the different types of educational programs. And we find that the girls who choose male-dominated study programs in higher education have the highest grades. It's this line here. And the boys who choose female-dominated vocational programs in upper secondary school have the lowest grades. That's the red one down here. Also among the girls, we find that those with the lowest grades choose female-dominated educational programs. And grades make less of a difference for whether men choose gender-typical or atypical studies in higher education. These patterns do not indicate that female-dominated fields have become more attractive. Further, we wanted to investigate the role of norms and beliefs for gendered educational choices. To get a better understanding of how young people think about who's suitable for which types of education, we conducted a survey experiment among 10th graders in Oslo. The students were given short texts describing fictive persons and were asked to recommend these persons different educational programs in upper secondary school. Sometimes the fictive person in the text would have a boy's name, like Martin, and sometimes a girl's name, like Julie. Otherwise, they were identical in terms of their described characteristics. We found that the students tended to most highly recommend college preparatory studies, that's the one in gray here, for both Martin and Julie. And among the vocational fields, neither Julie nor Martin were recommended to choose the female-dominated vocational fields. That's the red ones here. While the recommendations for the male-dominated vocational fields fell in between for both. We interpret these recommendations as a general expression of the attractiveness of the various educational programs. From previous research, we know that educational choices are closely related to social background. So we wanted to investigate whether there was variation in these recommendations according to the student's parental education level. Among the students with parents who had completed higher education, that's these ones, the recommendations varied according to whether the person in the text had a boy's name or a girl's name. When the person was called Martin, the pattern was similar to the average pattern I just showed. College preparatory is the highest recommended, female-dominated vocational programs are not recommended, and male-dominated vocational programs fall in between these two. So that's this one. But when the person was called Julie, these students did not recommend any of the vocational programs, only the college preparatory program. This was the case even when Martin and Julie were otherwise presented as completely identical with regard to their interest, their grade levels, their personality types, etc. Among the students with the lower educated parents, the recommendations were similar for Julie and Martin. That's these ones. This was the case even though the students with lower educated parents are themselves more likely to make more gendered educational choices. These students did not recommend female-dominated vocational programs either, neither to Julie nor to Martin. And interestingly, they were just as positive towards Julie's choice of male-dominated vocational fields as to Martin's choice of male-dominated vocational fields. In the survey, we also asked directly whether the students believed that boys and girls are born different and therefore suitable for different kinds of occupations. And even the students who agreed with this refrained from recommending the female-dominated vocational tracks to Julie. So only when the column goes above the line, they're being positive. Should have said that in the beginning, I presume. Accordingly, we could not find any group of students that recommended the female-dominated fields, neither to Martin nor to Julie. This does not fit so well with an explanatory model that emphasizes the beliefs in boys' and girls' suitability for different occupations. If this was the main explanation, we would expect to find that at least some groups of students would recommend female-dominated vocational tracks to Julie. So to sum up, these findings lead us to 4 main insights regarding young people's educational choices. Most students attend gender-balanced educational programs, and in today's educational system, men are more likely than women to choose educational programs dominated by the opposite sex in higher education. But this is not explained by the relative attractiveness of the female-dominated fields. Conscious and unconscious attitudes about gendered suitability for educational choice affect educational choices, and this means that changes in attitudes and beliefs can contribute to changes in educational choices as well. Gender essentialist beliefs do not seem to explain why so many girls still choose the female-dominated vocational tracks in upper secondary school. It is likely that these choices are better explained by opportunities and constraints. Overall, choosing an education dominated by the opposite sex is very uncommon. Status and pay has been important for non-traditional choices in the past, but it's not as likely that those mechanisms will be the drivers for change going forward. Based on our findings, it seems that now more than ever, systematic policies aimed at reducing cultural and structural constraints will be important in order to achieve further change. Thank you. one or two questions before we move on?
Thank you. This is very interesting. You showed us three main explanations that behind the different choices of education for men and women. This is my question. This is my question. It seems to me, perhaps I didn't catch exact what you told us, but it seems to me that women are more eager to choose male-dominated education than men are eager to choose female-dominated education. Is that correctly understood? And could that... Yes, okay, thank you.
I think that what I was saying is that historically this has been the case, and the result at the moment is that a lot of those educations have become gender balanced, so they're not male dominated anymore. And then what's left is what Maria was talking about earlier, the more hardcore STEM fields, information and technology and engineering, etc. And there the change is going a lot more slowly. All right, we'll move on to Paul Schøne. Paul Schøne is an economist and a research director at the Institute for Social Research. And he's an expert on wage discrimination, skill formation, and labor supply. In our project, Paul has been responsible for several articles on gender differences in management and the role of children for career mobility. And today, he'll provide us with some insights from these studies in his talk, Children and the Gender Gap in Management.
Okay, thank you for letting me have this opportunity to present my part of my contribution to this project. I'm going to present part of the project where we have been concerned with analyzing the importance of children for analyzing the gender gap in management. And it's joint work with Inés Ardoy and Kjersti Misjøsbakken. Those who want to read it, I think we have made it open, so it's free, accessible to everyone who wants to read it. So, the background for doing this is several, of course. It's fair to say that we have experienced, witnessed promising development over many aspects of gender inequality over the last decades, but even if the progress is rather slow. But still, women are still grossly underrepresented in management positions in the labor market. So in this article, in this paper, we ask how important is parenthood for explaining sort of the sustained gender gap in management positions in the labor market. I think this could be of some importance, but much of the empirical literature has looked at the impact of children on wages, and that's good reasons for that, because wages is important for level of living and stuff like that. But we argue that fewer have looked at management positions, so there might be a little bit market there for us, and let's answer that question as well. So what we do is just sort of compare outcomes of men and women in couples before and after entering parenthood. That's sort of basically what we do empirically. I'm going a little bit more in detail back to it a little bit later. So why is this potentially interesting, or why could parenthood affect the probability of getting a management position? If you ask an economist, you will say that if sort of the periods you are out of the labor market due to childbirth is not evenly distributed between men and women, you might see that women are staying longer away outside the labor market, and that might cause human capital depreciation, and which in turn might sort of negative effect both on wages and sort of in likelihood of getting a management position. And I think also there's some studies that sort of find and claim that women actively choose more family-friendly jobs after the arrival of a child. These here, for instance. And also another part of the project, we have looked at sort of the importance of children of entering the public sector, and do find strong support for that kind of mechanism. That sort of builds up the argument on the second part here. Third reason there are, of course, many other reasons, but I just put 3 on the blackboard here. You might say that longer career breaks, this topic has already been on the agenda here, but statistical discrimination also be playing a part here, that sort of employers use statistical discriminations to place equally productive men and women in different categories, which women, for instance, due to some averages, come short of and sort of will lose in the battle for management positions. Let me say that we don't disentangle between these explanations in our empirical analysis. It's purely register database, so we can't go into these and find which of these are most important. But if you find something, you should believe that potentially one of these factors may be at play. I've already said we use register data in this very good Norwegian register data, which everybody likes. Covers, takes a lot of time to get it, but when we get it, it's nice to have. Covers all individuals living in Norway. We have information about gender, childbirth, of course, marital status, education, age, and a couple identifiers, so we know who lives with whom and have children with whom. That's, of course, important here. And we link this data to employer-employee data with the information on work hours, occupation, and industry. And industry, occupation is important here because we're using occupation to identify whether you are a manager or not. The sample is, we have 5 cohorts of couples receiving their first child in 2005 to 2012. And we follow these couples 2 years prior to birth and up till 9 years after birth. So that's our data and our sample. The dependent variable, the outcome variable, is sort of the within couple gender management gap. So all analysis is done within couple here. And I've already said management position is defined by registry information. And we also control for differences in these couples in pre-birth, difference in education, age, work experience, and educational attainment. So we a little bit more stronger can claim that potentially we are catching up something causal. Yeah, as I said, our aim is sort of identify a causal relationship between having a child and career development, and not something else going on. I'm not going to go into detail how we do that, but there are some rather strong assumptions which you have to, which you can read about in the paper if you want to. If you accept them, you can interpret that these results as causal results of having a child. And we do regression analysis where we sort of analyze how the within couple difference in management likelihood is developing from a period before birth to a period after. So everything we do is sort of within household, within the couple you receive the child with. And we do control for pre-birth difference in observable characteristics. So this is just a raw means of the mean share in management position from a time since birth. This is right here. Yeah. This is the year, the x-axis, the year since birth, varying from 2 years before birth to 9 years after, and we see the sort of the pattern for the male and for the father and for the mothers. And we do see that after the birth that they sort of have a little bit different trajectories in their pattern. So we're going to see if that pattern survives when we do some more rigorous regression analysis. yeah, this is sort of the main, the main figure in the paper, I guess. This is sort of analysis, results from analysis, the regression analysis, where we, on the axis here, have the difference in the likelihood of being a manager, measured sort of when you have the father minus the mother. So most of the axis is on the plus side, meaning that the father has a larger likelihood of being a manager. And along the axis here, we sort of, this is at the time when they get the child, and this is up till 9 years after they get the child. And we do this analysis we do some difference. Model 1 is a simpler model than model 2, and model 3 is more complicated than model 2, so we sort of build on control variables in order to be more certain that we are picking up some robust findings. And what we do find is that the gender management gap is almost zero when the child arrives, but it builds up monotonically in the years after. So the message from these figures is very clear that the arrival of the first child sort of increases the gender management gap within couples in a household. And if you sort of believe the model, this is sort of we do claim that this is a causal impact of having a child. And we do say that this is rather robust with respect to having different control variables. And also in the last model where we try to, I didn't say that, but our definition of management is rather broad in model 1 to model 3. But in model 4, we take out the top managers and we run the regressions on these as well. And we do find that also within this group, we do find this pattern that children sort of increases, and it contributes to widening the gender gap in management. The next thing we do is that we run some sort of heterogeneity analysis to see how are these results for different types of household. We do distinguish households according to education, the length and type of education on the father and the mother. And we do an analysis where we pick out households where the mother have a rather tight labor market attachment to see whether that matters. And we also conduct analysis for households where they have a more equal sharing of the maternal benefits in a period after the child arrives. So maybe I'm running out of time, but this is analysis of the first question regarding type and length. The first area is when we difference with respect to education length. Here we see that here is only the father having a tertiary or higher education. Here is the situation where only the mother has higher education. And here is the situation where they're rather equal. So we do find that the gap is much larger when the father only has higher education. You can think of these are where the bargaining power should be more equal when both have higher education, and that also where the gender gap is smallest, but there's still a gap there too as well. And we do the same exercise where we instead of the length of education, we pick out typically management type of education, business administration, and we do find very much of the same pattern. Lastly, we do this labor market attachment and the sharing of the parental leave period. And if you look at couples where the mother is high attached or very close related to the labor market, the gender gap is much smaller. You have to look at the scale here is a little bit different compared to the other figures we looked at. And also when we look at household where they're more gender equalized, we do also find much less explanation for children for the gender management gap. Of course, you should be when we sort of look at this figure, we should be a little bit careful interpreting, because there are selection going on in these figures, which also will contribute to this pattern. We have looked at this, the last two figures. So what have we found in this part of the project? We do find that we claim that parenthood increases the management gap between men and women, an increase about 5 percentage points 9 years after birth, and we do not see any strong signs of catching up, which you might expect, perhaps, as time goes by. The management gap is larger in households where the husband has the educational advantage, and it's smaller in households with high attachment mothers, and in households where the parental leave is more equally shared. That's what I had.
Thank you, Paul. Any questions? Maria.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I have a question. I wonder whether you broke it down at all by public versus private sector managers?
Yeah, good question. No, we haven't done that. Could have done it.
Do you think there would be a difference, or?
Probably. Women go more into public sector, and I think statistics. I think we have seen that the statistics do show it also. They are more present in the management job in the public sector. So I think we would have seen.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. You did say something about the distribution of the parental leave between the two and the effect on the gender pay gap. But did you also look at or control for the duration of the parental leave?
Again, control for?
The duration, I mean the amount of months taken.
No, we didn't. In that last analysis, we just pick out the households that, I don't remember the share exactly now, but where they're equally shared the period out. But we didn't, generally, we haven't controlled for the period duration. Out of
okay. Because it makes sense to, that the longer the absence from the labor market, this will reduce the qualifications of that person. So if you think that the labor market is pricing competence fairly?
Yeah, I guess we could include it in trying to explain the results, but I'm not sure I would like to have it in as a control from the beginning, because it's part of the results, I guess. It's when you all the other control variables is sort of pre-birth controls. Everything else that happens afterwards we let split out. And if we control for periods after the labor market, that might be as a control for some kind of mechanism or something to see what happens to the management gap when we do control for that. That could be a good idea.
Thank you. So we'll move on now to the last presentation from the project itself. And let's see. So Mary Blair-Loy, she has been part of the project. She's going to give a keynote after the break also. But as part of the project, she's also presenting here today. She's a professor of sociology and the founding director of Center for Research on Gender in the Professions at the University of San Diego. Her fields of study includes gender, the economy, work, and family, with specific focus on broadly shared cultural models that shape the way we live our lives. She has had a special interest in these dynamics in the business elite, and her award-winning book, Competing Devotions, Career and Family Among women executives have been an important source of inspiration for our research team's studies of gender and executive careers. We've been fortunate that Mary has been part of our project, and she's been central to the Norway-US comparison, which is what she will share some insights from today.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to the team. It's really a pleasure to be here. Make sure I know how to use this. Yes, okay. This project is with Sigtuna Harenyo, who is my partner in this research effort. So we have two research questions. One is there more gender balance at the top of the business sector in the gender egalitarian, family-friendly welfare state of Norway compared to the neoliberal, individualistic, dog-eat-dog United States? And if not, then why not? So if we look at the Global Gender Gap Report, Norway consistently ranks among the top 1 or 2 of gender equal countries, and the United States usually is ranked late 40s, high 40s or 50. Here, 51 in 2018, suggesting that overall there's more gender equality in Norway than in the U.S. But we focus in on the very, very senior management in the largest companies in the US and Norway. We did a mapping of all of the CEOs, the executive committees, and these are the next layer of management which report directly to the CEO, as well as the boards of directors in the 457 largest companies in the 2 countries. And we also conducted interviews with executive search professionals. So people who work for large executive search firms, a well-known one, for example, is Korn Ferry, just to ask them as expert informants, what are employers looking for when recruiting senior management? So this picture shows you the proportions of women in various top management positions. And the bottom bars here, the green is Norwegian, and the US is, the red is US. And here we actually see the bars go over the 20% mark. It's really the only place where that happens. And that is in the board of directors. Over 20% of boards in Norway, board seats are held by women in part due to the quota, which is important for the listed companies in Norway. But all of the other positions, if we look at board chairs, proportion of women on the executive committee, women on the executive committee who are specifically in line or operational positions, here we see that there are fewer than 20% of these important positions are actually held by women in both countries. So the second research question then is why? Especially why would this be the case in Norway? If we look at existing explanations for gender gaps in careers, there's discrimination or outright hostility in the US. This is illegal but still present. Research on bias and in-group favoritism, some of the research that Maria introduced earlier today, and other research show that implicit bias is still very much present in the US. And there are ongoing challenges of double binds and gendered parenthood. The outright hostility is diminishing in the Nordics, business careers in the business sector accept the idea of gender equality in business and other endeavors of working life, as well as caregiving. There's been a decline of gender bias, as shown in experimental studies in the Nordics. So here, the Nordics look far ahead of the US in terms of the decline of bias. But gendered parenthood is a common pattern, and we saw some evidence of that in the last presentation. So in our data of the CEOs and executive committees of the largest companies, it's interesting to know what position did the CEO have in their previous position, so before they became a CEO. And 90% or so 90% or so had positions in high-level line jobs, so key operational jobs, such as being the head of a business unit or a region. And very few, 0 to 5%, their previous position was in a high-level staff position, such as head of HR or head of marketing or head of the legal department. And this is important because in Norway, while almost 40% of the top staff positions are filled by women, only 14% of the top line positions are filled by women. So as women are increasingly, this is an example of that horizontal segregation. So if there are fewer women in line positions, that means fewer women in the running to be promoted to CEO. Some distinctions between the US and Norwegian samples, or populations really, are that in the US, most of the CEOs have a career which is largely internal. So if you look at the top bars, the male US and purple female US bars, and then the bottom bars in each cluster are the Norwegian bars. The light blue is male Norway, and the peach-colored is female Norway. And so in the US, most of the managers, the CEOs, were recruited internally. They largely built their careers within the company that they now head up as CEO. In contrast, most of the Norwegian CEOs built careers in other companies and were then recruited externally. And so this is probably linked to the different sizes of the companies, that there's simply more, a longer career ladder within the much larger, on average, companies in the US. In Norway, there's constant attention to external opportunities and being ready to jump to another company. Another difference is to look at the ages of the CEOs in the two national contexts. So the first bar is the current age, so when we mapped them. But more important is the age in which, when they first became CEO. So the first two bars are the US CEOs, and they first became CEO at 49 for US men and at age 52 for US women. But in contrast, in the Norwegian case, they first became CEO in their early to mid 40s, so considerably younger. And when did these CEOs get that first crucial line or operational position? Mid 40s for men, but for the Norwegians, it was the mid 30s when the people who are now CEO got that first important director level line position. But in Norway, among top managers, the average age for becoming a parent is 29. So we really can see this pressure on careers if the average age of becoming a parent is 29 and you have to have that first really big job by your mid-30s. There's just an enormous amount that needs to get done during a few years of the lifespan to be seen as competitive. So to better understand these patterns, we turn to our expert informants, these senior partners in executive consulting firms or search firms. So we asked one recruiter in a large international-oriented firm in Norway, why are there so few women at the top in Norway? And she says, basically, they're not on the short list, because to get to a certain level, you've got to have some sort of experiences that qualify you. And to build this, I guess, men do the right moves earlier. So when in the career would you say that this is crucial? Sarah says, after you work 5 years, then you should start to be conscious about your choices. You should be more strategic and know what you want. And would that generally be when you are 30? Yeah, so that's the problem. Because you think that it's very convenient to not start a new job now because I want to be pregnant within a year. And then you are on your leave. And you come back, and it's very convenient to be in the same position when you come back. And then, but oh, maybe we want another child. So that's it. So then maybe you are in the same position for 7 years. And Sarah, who presumably at this point is talking exclusively about women who are the ones who can become pregnant. Yeah, and in the same company, and then you are looked upon as less from others because you haven't tried new things and changed, and you don't get the same exposure. I was told it was very convenient to be in the same position when I get back from maternity leave. So she's saying that in management, women get the advice that it doesn't make sense to try to get that big promotion while you're getting ready to get pregnant, or on leave, obviously, or when you first come back from leave. These jobs have a steep learning curve. They often involve travel, long hours. Better to excel in the job you know than to try to jump ahead and get promoted. What does it take to make it to the top? We talked to a senior partner in a different search firm in Norway. Let me just pull my notes up here so I can see this better. So Carl says, to be a top executive, that's cutthroat prioritizing. And it requires that you have someone very flexible on the home front. I'd say it's easily 60 to 70 hours a week, and a lot of informal stuff beyond that, because one wants to do so much. And at some point you realize that it requires so much of me that I just can't deliver. So then we ask, well, then how is this possible for people who also want to become parents or have young children? And he says, well, you need some sort of home help, or choose not to have children. He says that in the private sector, you simply cannot participate in the daily lives of young children if you're one of these successful top managers. We asked similar questions of US search firm consultants. And Kayla says, when we asked her what might a successful career require from the spouse, she says, well, a lot more than mine gave. It requires more than anything a spouse, and this is male or female, who recognizes and honors the other one's job as being as important to the family as his or hers is. And therefore, when anything else comes up, that anything else can also be the spouse's responsibility, right? Versus, my job is more important than yours. I do think we have been a culture where in many cases the woman's job has been subservient to the men's job. And so search firm consultants in both countries said, you know, what you really need is a third spouse, somebody at home who can really take care of things. As Kayla says, what happens when something happens with the child? It's a school day and you and your spouse are both called into a really important client meeting. You've got to have support systems. And I don't know if it's family or a full-time live-in. But one of the challenges in Norway is that live-in help is more morally contested. It's far more available and seen as legitimate in the US. In both countries, search consultants said, well, one option is not to have children, another is to wait until you're 40. From a purely career perspective, Arve says, if that's the only way you measure your success and happiness, then I would say to women, wait until you're 40 before getting children, so that you have time to climb as high as possible and get established at a director level, and then take a quick 6-month leave and then get back to the same job immediately. So that crucial decade and getting the top line position as quickly as possible, one way to do that is to do that delay childbearing until that point. And Sarah in the US says exactly the same thing. One thing that I think is really important to point out is that fast advancement becomes seen as a qualification in and of itself. And we ask one of the search consultants about this explicitly, and he says, yes, it is. There is no better sign of a great CV than to see that someone has advanced rapidly in a system. That's the best assurance I can get. So rather than selecting top executives who are experienced and perhaps mature and grown up, more and more the expectation is that the person is young and promising, and moving very quickly up the ladder is seen as evidence of quality. So in conclusion, the challenge of parenthood when careers and families are both built before 40. Direct discrimination is diminishing. Bias and in-group favoritism are still present in the US, but declining in the Nordic context. But the double binds and challenges of parenthood, especially for mothers, continue. And this is exacerbated, particularly in Norway, by the demand for a steep upward mobility and a career window which is seen as closing at 40. Thank you.
Any questions? It's the same. Stay for a little bit and then we'll have a break.
Thanks again for this interesting presentation. I just, what I think your study really shows is just that you can't have both. And I struggle to see the gender issue here, because as a top executive, you really need to work 80 hours weeks, and that's what the market pays you to do. So it holds for men as well, this choice. Either you would like a family or a child, or you have to go into these top jobs, which represent a very small part of the labor market.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So these jobs are important symbolically. The people who hold seats at the pinnacle of corporate power they're well known throughout the company and often throughout the society. There was one study done in the US that showed that a CEO is more likely to be named John than to be female. And certainly these jobs require long hours, but most men in these positions, in fact, do have spouses and children. Sigtuna Helreño has done another study, and she's found that women in top management are far more likely than men to be single, divorced, and have fewer children than they would have liked, or have no children. So perhaps both whoever holds the position needs to work long hours, but certainly women pay a much higher price on average. I think maybe a more direct response to your question is, it's an arbitrary cultural construction that fast advancement in and of itself be seen as quality and promotability. So why, if the age of first being promoted to CEO is 43, and someone who takes longer because they in fact spend some time with their children, why are they seen as unpromotable if they're older? So that, I think that we should question that, because I think that is actually not the best use of talent or time for women or for men, and it really arbitrarily constricts who is seen as having the most talent.
Just a quick follow-up, because I also think that this study needs to incorporate somehow the economic incentives within the household. Because if you have a top earning representative within the household, there's pretty little incentive for the other one to gain a career like this.
And so I think that the last presentation we saw with the overtime data is so helpful, because often what happens is both members of a couple, let's say a heterosexual couple, are equally likely to become managers or to have a high salary. And then why do women disproportionately take a path that veers them away from that? So this incentive is something that is constructed out of our gendered families and labor markets. It doesn't just appear.
Thank you. So time has come for a little break. We'll have a 20-minute break, and we'll start again. We'll start again 2:30. Thank you. I'm really happy that you guys are engaging in conversation with each other. I think that's wonderful. But you have to sit down now. All right, so Mary Blair-Loy was just introduced before the break, but I'll add a little bit to her introduction now before her keynote. In recent years, Professor Mary Blair-Loy has extended her research from her research framework beyond the business elite to other parts of the labor market, including professionals in science and technology. So her talk today is entitled Reinforcing Gender Segregation by Constructing Masculine Brilliance and Devotion in Academic STEM. There you go.
Wonderful to see all of you again. I have a new outfit. So I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators on this project, Aaron Seck at University of Michigan, Pamela Kosman, Olga Mayarova, and Jordan Packer at UC San Diego. I will be presenting several empirical illustrations to make a broader theoretical point about how gender segregation and male dominance are continually culturally constructed and reconstructed in academic STEM. The empirical illustrations come from a Case University. It's a top 20 globally, top 10 national public university in the United States. I have a lot of data on this institution, including academic personnel data on all 500 plus STEM faculty, so professors who work in sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I also have video recordings of job talks for finalists, people who are trying to be hired at that university as a professor. And we also did a separate study of undergraduate engineering majors. I won't go into detail for just to keep on time, but if you have any questions about any of the data, I'm happy to answer them later. So first, I will explain what I mean by cultural understandings of excellence and devotion. In Maria Charles's remarks this morning, she talked about a variety of ways in which gender segregation is created, reinforced, and sometimes changed. And one of the ways she discussed were cultural structures. And my work focuses specifically on cultural schemas of excellence and devotion. Then I will discuss how these schemas penalize motherhood, they devalue women's brilliance. My data in the first parts of the study, in the black font here, this is on established professors in academic STEM. Then we look at the experience of early career academics applying for jobs and how there are some signs of hopeful change but ongoing devaluation of women as well. And then the last section of the talk will give you a couple of examples in our study of undergraduate women and men engineering majors. So cultural understandings of excellence and devotion. The first cultural schema really that should start our discussion is the belief that science is a meritocracy and that scientists care about and know how to objectively evaluate true merit in science. Most of the respondents in my population avidly believe that most of the time scientists are fair, objective, and accurate in assessing evidence of excellence. A paradox is that science highly values meritocracy and objectivity, yet it continually produces unequal outcomes for STEM professionals. So we're going to look more closely at what I call cultural schemas. And these are cultural structures which specify our shared understanding of what we know as reality. They're developed over time, they're largely unquestioned, and they shape not only our cognitive understandings, but also our emotional commitments and our moral understandings. It can be hard to recognize these schemas in our own society, so we can pretend that we're anthropologists, or in your case, since I'm presenting US data, perhaps it'll be easier to see how these schemas operate in the US and how they may be similar or different to the situation in Norway. I'd like to tell you about the schema of work devotion. And this is a moralized cultural mandate that defines work as a calling. It specifies an intensive identification with one's discipline, It says that work demands and deserves undivided allegiance, and that work offers a variety of rewards, including the opportunity of transcendence, transcending our own personal limitations and connecting with others in pursuit of a broader, ennobling mission. What we find, though, often is that mothers, compared to men and women without children, mothers are often assumed to have divided allegiance because they're also captivated by the schema of devotion to family, and therefore are unable to fully commit to the long hours that a calling demands. So in terms of the study population, it's important to let you know that there are no average differences by race, gender, or motherhood status in the attributes of being an excellent scientist that scientists say they care about. So if we look at the number, visibility, or impact of scholarly works, grant dollars, work dedication, and work hours, including the hours they spend on their research, there's no difference in these attributes. So in this top university, the faculty are uniformly productive, and if there are differences, there are differences within these demographic groups, not across them. And work devotion is largely celebrated. For example, one respondent said, "I can solve problems at all times. There is great pleasure in that, actually, in cutting through a mathematical problem and seeing the light. And you can take that pleasure at any time." Somebody else says, "I take work home with me all the time. I really love my work. I feel lucky to be able to do this job." So I included this quotation because I knew that I would be speaking in part to economist colleagues. Work devotion is separate from simply financial incentives. As this person says, "If I were independently wealthy, I'd be perfectly happy to pay for the opportunity to have this job." The part that I like best is discovering things that no one on this planet knew before. So work devotion is broadly adhered to in this population. And importantly, mothers look similar to others on our measures: time spent on research, productivity, grants, etc. Yet there is a widespread belief that mothers are in fact more distracted, less devoted. In fact, some say that mothers can't really even think about science in a systemic way. One brief example of this widespread view is from a man who is married to a woman professor. They have children. And he's very sympathetic, and he says it's just really hard for new mothers to get back into science. Just the day-to-day aspects of keeping a laboratory going, even just thinking about things in a way that you have to keep up with current discoveries in the field, just getting back into the grind and thinking about science is very difficult. The mothers I spoke to acknowledge that it is very challenging to care for young children and maintain their productive careers, but they say they are doing it. And by doing so, they're making a moral statement about how much they love their work. They're sacrificing time with their children as evidence of their devotion to science. So by this measure, they're perhaps more devoted than anyone else in their departments. One woman says, "Even like at nighttime, if my kid's like, 'Mom, just lay with me before I go to sleep,' I'm always anxious because I'm like, I can't. I have work to do. So I don't always like to say that, but it's stressing me out," and then they pick up on that. motherhood is stigmatized, and so many women try to pass as non-mothers. They try to time their childbirth for the summer months. They don't take parental leave, which is stigmatized. This is an example of a professor who was hired as an assistant professor 15 years earlier, and she had a baby when she was hired. She didn't let the hiring committee know that. And then after she was established, it became apparent that her child had special needs and needed quite a lot of attention from numerous specialists and medical professionals. And so she says, it was really pretty insane. I never told them at work. I'd say, I have an off-campus appointment. I arranged my schedule around whatever was necessary. I was always available. So she's trying very hard to conform to the schema of work devotion. I just farmed out everything. I know people would say, I can't afford to do that. I couldn't afford not to do it. Another example of someone saying that she didn't take any parental leave. She worked up until her water broke in her pregnancy. She says, we survived, and it was totally fine. But it's a very precious time when you have a baby. It's a very special time, and I feel like I got ripped off. So these mothers are, again, by all of our objective measures and their self-reports, they're very devoted, they're very productive, yet almost by definition, they are seen as less devoted than those who are not mothers. And this is reflected in the salaries. The personnel data provides data on salaries, and we found that fathers were paid on average almost $4,000 more than mothers after taking into account demographics, department, level, and productivity. The promotion system is largely transparent, and salaries are public. You can go to a website and look up everybody's salary. So this is not, people's salaries are not secret, but because mothers are assumed to be less productive, this salary gap is seen as fair. And it's not just a motherhood gap, it's actually a gender gap because most of the women are mothers and most of the men are fathers. So that's a schema of work devotion. Let's turn now to the cultural schema of scientific excellence. And this is a constellation of characteristics that are a cultural yardstick for measuring up the competence and worthiness of an academic scientist. And the ideal is someone who is brilliant, creative, and groundbreaking, assertive, competitive, strong, and self-promoting. And women are often assumed to not fully manifest these ideals, and then they are devalued. I'm just going to move a little bit more quickly here. In our data, in our quantitative data and our qualitative data, women and racial minorities are viewed as less excellent, even controlling for actual productivity. They report receiving less respect, less professional integration, and this is particularly true for women of color. So what we find then is among these established professors, work devotion and scientific excellence are these moralized cultural understandings that create lenses that devalue many women and many mothers. The motherhood gap of about $4,000, A, that's a lot. Academics don't have particularly large salaries in the US. And B, future salary increases are a proportion of your current salary, so that gap tends to grow over the course of the career. However, most of our faculty have been there for quite a while, and so maybe things look more promising are more equitable among early career scholars. And the challenge is that to hire a new faculty member, it's the same people, the same women and men that are beholden to these schemas who are making the hiring decisions. So to try to understand this, my colleagues and I did a series of 2 studies of job talks by finalists for assistant professor positions in engineering. Maria mentioned earlier that in the US, only 15% of engineers are women. And so these are finalists. So there's been a faculty job recruitment, and there may be something like 200 applicants for one assistant professor position. The applicants have PhDs, they generally have postdoctoral positions, publications, strong evidence of promise. And the women and men who are selected as finalists are really the best of the best. Maybe 3 people are invited to campus, and the most important part of their 2-day campus interview is their job talk, when they stand up, kind of like I'm doing now, and give a presentation on their research. We measure the extent to which they are interrupted during that presentation. So it is common to not save all questions for the Q&A at the end, but rather to sometimes raise hands and be acknowledged, or sometimes just blurt out questions and challenges during the talk. We see these job talks as rituals or liturgies, when not only is the person at the podium trying to display his or her excellence, brilliance, and quality and originality, but the people in the audience, particularly the faculty in the department, are displaying their own excellence by challenging and peppering with questions and displaying for their graduate students what excellence means. So in our first study, we found that women received, on average, more questions than men. And some candidates, women and men, received an excessive number of questions, so 30 to 50 questions in a 45-minute talk. So it would be very hard to even really get any momentum and to bring the talk to a compelling conclusion. My colleague, Pamela Kosman, who's on the engineering faculty, said that then the faculty in the meetings would criticize the candidate for not having really given a great talk, and that person would be dinged. So that was our first study. We did a second study when we were able to measure more aspects of the questions. In this study, we found that the gender difference in the number of questions overall was erased, in part because we think of all the training, the search committee training that we did, in part showing them the results from the first study. But we did find that there were differences in tone, and women were more likely than men to receive rude questions. So we measured whether the tone was supportive or skeptical or negative. And we found that women were less likely than men candidates to receive supportive questions, whether it was a new question or a follow-up, and that women were more likely to receive negative questions than men. We also looked at the effect of the proportion of faculty in the department who had gone through the faculty recruitment training, basically on how not to be a jerk. And we found that that decreased the number of rude questions. I'll just show you the one example here of overlapping questions, although we have a similar finding for different kinds of questions. So the proportion of trained faculty decreases the number of overlapping questions, which are seen to be rude because you're talking over the presenter. The percentage of women in the department also decreased the proportion of overlapping questions. And there's an interaction. So this effect was strongest in departments with more women and more trained faculty. The departments are still predominantly male-dominated, but even just 1 or 2 more women could make the overall climate somewhat different. So what we find is that there are some limits of training. Women are still receiving ruder questions. However, the gender difference in the number of questions and just being peppered with questions, that has gone away. However, there was one aspect of the search that we did not think to train on, and this was the ways in which candidates are introduced. It never occurred to me to look at this because the way that we introduce candidates is part of this ritual. And I just took it for granted that we introduced candidates in a certain way, highlighting the salient, impressive pieces of on their CVs or their resumes. But one of my undergraduates, Jordan Packer, who was on my research team, she, as a relative outsider, she noticed this pattern, and I told her to follow up. And we find that, on average, women presenters received less respectful introductions than men. Compared to the introductions of men presenters, women presenters were less likely to have their research awards mentioned in the introduction. And this is controlling for whether or not they had a research award on their CV. Women were less likely to receive highly positive introductions, and they are more likely to have the introduction time filled up, kind of the clock rundown, by these sort of long-winded, rambling, less well-prepared introductions, filled up with non-essential remarks, and even, in 6 cases, inappropriate remarks. And all of these results are statistically significant. But let's turn to some examples. These are transcripts from the job talks. Men were more likely to receive highly positive introductions, so highlighting the brilliance and originality and productivity and promise of Jacob Robinson. Jacob is wrapping up his PhD, notably for someone who is still a PhD student. When Jacob applied here, he had almost 20 publications, including several Best Paper Awards. I checked last night, his work, he's a PhD student, his work has already received over 350 citations, and he has an H index of 10. So if you'll excuse me, I need to go start doing research again. Ha ha. But these are just numbers. What I think is really exciting about Jacob's work, and what all of you who have met him already know, is that he has this wonderful, infectious curiosity. He has great research ideas about all sorts of things, and you'll see lots of examples of this in his talk. So these really strong, positive introductions, it seems like a great way to introduce a candidate. But women were less likely to receive these positive introductions, even when they had similar records. And again, these are the very top people in a job search. Earlier, Maria talked about all of the barriers, social barriers and stereotypes that would that women would have to overcome to major in and excel in, and then get a PhD in this gender non-conforming field such as engineering. Here they are, finalists in this job, and they're less likely to get such a positive introduction, framing them as brilliant. Women were more likely to receive inappropriate introductions, however. As you all know, Dr. Elizabeth, graduated from one of the best universities in the world, and then she went to another university, and I can tell you that's an awesome place. My girlfriend went there. Another example, Esther Wynn is an engineer almost through and through, except for 1 year of flirting with a different field, right? So before becoming a PhD student, she earned her undergraduate degree, and boy, was she a busy undergraduate student. She just couldn't sit still. So let me tell you a little bit more about her undergraduate work. So this is someone who has written a dissertation, earned her PhD, she's had a postdoctoral fellowship, and the introducer is going to tell you about what a busy bee she was as an undergrad. What I'd like to do now is turn to the final empirical illustration. And this is a focus that we have on undergraduate students at this university who are majoring in engineering. And one thing we're interested in are the ways in which these gender stereotypes can be institutionalized and become kind of concretized in practices and policies and further infiltrate our metrics of evaluation. And one way to try to understand this is to look at career assessment tests. So these are tests that high school students or college students or really anyone can take. Maria said earlier, often young people aren't really sure what they want to do. And so you can take a career assessment test. And we study two of them. One is ONET, and this relies upon a methodology that was developed by the father of career assessment tests, Holland. And it is part of the Department of Labor, and it's free, and it is used by millions of people. And the other test we look at is Tradeify, which is a more recent test which promises to mirror the insights from big data and psychology to help you understand yourself and your best career, live your best life in 90 seconds flat. And so what we did is we studied we recruited 121 engineering majors. So these were mostly juniors and seniors, so people in their third and fourth year of college. Engineering is impacted. That means you have to declare an engineering major before or in your first year of college. It's very hard to get in otherwise because far more people want the major than there are slots. So these folks are already engineering majors. And we measured their GPA and their satisfaction with the major, their planned persistence, and their self-assessment of how good they were. And then we're curious, okay, well, for these folks, we knew from earlier literature that women were less likely than men to be recommended engineering as an occupation for a lot of the reasons that Maria outlined. But among people who are already engineering majors, if they were to take the test, what would the test tell them? And so we found that there is a gender gap. The predicted number of engineering occupations among the top 10 recommended by the career assessment test, different ways we looked at it, but there were always, men always received more engineering occupations listed than women that were recommended for them. Well, what about the probability that an engineering occupation would appear among the top 3 recommendations that the CAT produced? And again, there's a gender gap across both tests. Men were more likely than women to be recommended engineering among one of their top 3 recommendations. And if we look at the effects of satisfaction with the engineering major, we find that those who were more satisfied with their major were more likely to be recommended an engineering occupation in their top 3. But you can see from the red bar for women students below, women are less likely than men, as we saw in the previous slide. In fact, very satisfied women, so the most satisfied women, are about as likely to be recommended in engineering in the top 3 as are men who are between very unsatisfied and moderately unsatisfied with engineering. In terms of persistence, the red line below is women. The dotted blue line above is men. And among women who say they are very likely to persist in engineering after graduation, they are about as likely to be recommended engineering in a top 3 list of their occupations produced by the career assessment test. The very likely to persist women are about as likely to get an engineering occupation as the moderately unlikely men. So, in conclusion, I've used different empirical illustrations to make the argument that cultural schemas of excellence and devotion broadly shape our understanding of what makes a good scientist. These are cognitive, they're emotional. I didn't go into the emotional side of this in this short presentation. They're also moral. And they shape our vision of scientific brilliance in ways that systematically devalue the assessment of women's brilliance and dedication in academic STEM. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions for Mary before we move on, if there are any. Yes, Ivan.
About 40 years ago, I studied the Holland scores for the occupations in DOT, Dictionary of Occupational Title, and I was struck by their conventional biases in attitudes towards different occupations and and so I'm a little shocked to see that ONET is still using these scores, because they must be 60 years out of date.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And so there have been a lot of critiques, and Holland and others working on these scores have revised the tests. And then they say, well, if there are gender differences, it's because women and men are socialized differently. And we're just showing you what's really there. So we're just shining a mirror up to the society. So what's important in our study is, okay, well, what happens when people who are actually engineers or engineering students take these tests?
Any other questions? There will be time also after the first part of the panel conversation for more questions, if you have any. All right. So thank you, Mary. We are now getting ready for the panel conversation. So I've already introduced you to our keynote speakers, Maria Charles and Mary Blair-Loy. And the third person joining us for the panel conversation is Mari Teigen. My guess is that most of you in this room knows Mari Teigen. She's a research professor at the Institute for Social Research and the head of CORE, our Center for Research on Gender Equality. She's one of Norway's leading experts on gender equality, and her research engages with change and stability in gender relations through analysis of gender equality policies, social elites, gender segregation in the labor market, and in academia. Mari has contributed to the project through several articles about gender inequalities in the labor market and gender equality policies. So I'd like to welcome the three of you now up to the stage. And I'll join you also. I'll move this over. without falling off the stage. All right. No, I'm okay. I think I'm okay. Are the... Oh, I see. That's good. Thank you. All right. Går det greit? Hva skjer? Er jeg oppå der også? Okay. Thank you for all the assistance. All right, so since Mari has not had the chance to speak yet, I thought that I'd give her a few more minutes at the start to comment on anything she prefers to comment on from what's been going on today.
Yeah. I knew that you were going to ask me that question, I mean that kept me taking notes throughout the seminar. I mean, the first thing I mean, obviously, I've been a part of the project. And so I really is not a neutral observer of what has been said here today. But I think that we should recognize the importance of sharing all this knowledge about gender segregation in the labor market, because it has been such an crucial theme for several debates on gender inequality in the Norwegian society, and especially the puzzle, how can it be that the Norwegian society and the other Nordic countries are more gender segregated than many other countries in the world. So I also think that it was important to have, I think Maria Charles' contribution to this field has been very important for understanding the development, and also how these essentializing myths and how we think about gender actually may have an important meaning for people's choices. Maybe today the most important debate is about how, I mean, what we have been mainly discussing here today is the STEM field and how to get more women into male-dominated occupations. But really, the big question today is probably how to get more men into the women-dominated professions. So yeah, but we will come into that, into this debate. But then we could also think that there was kind of a controversy in the perspectives contributed by Charles compared to Erling Barth's introduction. At least you contributed different kinds of explanations, in a way, for the gender segregated labor market. I would think that it is the combination of these more structural perspectives that Erling contributed, and the acknowledging of gender stereotypical thinking and essentializing myths that may bring us forward in understanding the gender segregated labor market, and also how to change it. And I actually would, I mean, although I've been a part of this project, I must say that I think this is really a major contribution we have made when we have done this analysis showing that actually the Nordic, or it's not our analysis, but analyzing showing that the Nordic labor markets are not longer among the most gender segregated labor markets, and that the high level of labor market segregation is connected to high female labor participation. And as Erling showed in his presentation, that if you include homemakers into what you think about as the labor market, the picture changes fundamentally. And this is important, especially because we have these new types of debates where it has been argued that the Nordic labor markets are so highly gender segregated because women actually make more traditional choices than they did in another type of working or labor market context. And what we find is that still men and women make quite gender segregated choices, but if we want to look at the direction of the change, the main thing that has happened is that women are making more untraditional choices, and maybe no surprise that they do this because it is beneficial for wages and careers. Mm-hmm. So it's not so difficult to understand these changes. Okay, maybe I should just quit here, although we're just in the, because I could
go on.
But I mean,
we
also
can,
Liza's contribution also shows these differences in the valorization of female-dominated educations and male-dominated and gender-balanced educations, which fits into the whole picture here.
Yeah. Thank you. You guys were taking some notes, I saw. Do you want to comment on or respond to what Mari was saying?
I was very interested to hear what you've been doing over the last 5-6 years since I was here last. And I think your research is very exciting and interesting. I mean, just one thing I would say, I think that it's important not to rely too heavily on segregation indices, on sort of talking about level and pattern, a level of segregation. So I've argued for a long time that this obscures a lot of heterogeneity. I think it's more useful to look at specific occupations or specific sectors of the occupational structure, because there's a lot of evidence that the processes that determine gender composition vary, and even the variables that influence gender composition vary a lot across occupations. And so it's not the case that sort of all occupations rise and fall together in terms of the gender composition. So you have, very targeted sector-specific effects of certain things like service sector expansion, ideological traditionalism, and so on. So I think it's, at this point, now that we've sort of exhausted this kind of maybe phase in the research project of, looking at these indices, it's time to really zero in on particular occupations.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a comment, Mary?
Yeah, I think the work of this group is so exciting and impressive. And
excuse me, could you put the mic a bit closer to the mic?
That's probably.
I agree that the group has produced a very impressive body of evidence. And in terms of Maria's comment, the paper by Paul Schoen, am I saying that correctly?
It's good enough.
And Liza, in terms of this question, that you're pointing out, it's important to really focus on specific occupations. And so you look at management, you look at top management. Sigtuna and I are looking at the very top management, and that's I think definitely a couple of steps in that direction. And I heard someone ask Paul that I guess this was in the Q&A after your comments about whether or not you had distinguished between, maybe you asked, between private and public sector managers. So I think that would be really important to do next. And I was actually wondering if I was interpreting the graphs correctly. So at the year, you have year 0, and then the child is born, and then through year 9. And then in many of the graphs, it seemed that the within couple gap grew over time. And so I think what that shows, and then the qualitative data that I presented is another lens into that, is that these decisions that are made at one point in time have these effects that are, they sort of put people on these tracks, these institutionalized tracks, and then you can't really get off. And so I think that that's an important part of the story as well. Did those graphs control for the number of children?
No. So that's part of the story as well.
In another study that I've done with Aaron Seck on parenting and STEM, using nationally representative data over time, longitudinal data, we find that mothers, only 46% of mothers who started off in professional STEM jobs, only 46% stay after the birth of their first child. And the effects of future children are negligible. So it's that first, at least in the US, in Norway I think it's somewhat different with the long leaves and things, but in the US, it's that first child. And in part I think because that just triggers this new status of being a mother. And there's so much that goes along with that pulls women off of these professional tracks.
Thank you. So we've already started talking a little bit about this sort of development over time and the impact or what the increased freedom does, or privilege, I guess, is another way of talking about it. But I feel like, as Mari was sort of starting to say, I feel like we haven't really landed it. It's still sort of up in the air what's going on here. Is increasing privilege or increasing freedom creating more segregation, or is it not creating more segregation? And there was a question from the audience about the structural sort of constraints that are related to these issues. So I was wondering if any of you wanted to have a go at sort of tidying up something in terms of understanding what's really going on here.
Well,
I'm looking at you, Maria.
The one thing I would say is that I think sort of societal affluence creates material conditions that result, and there's a lot of research by Engelhardt and others on this sort of post-materialist value system, right? Where all of a sudden, there's no longer a concern for one's existential security, and one therefore, and so cultural values change in societies. So you see these broad-based societal changes that result in sort of, more concern about quality of life issues. So you get more concerned about environment, you get more concerned about rights of all different sort of categories of people. So you have the freedom to think beyond just where your next meal is coming from. And one thing, and so this also changes our understandings of the meaning of work and the meaning of education. And we see it, or many of us, those of us who are in a privileged position, see it as an opportunity for self-realization, self-expression, and that is really a narrative that is very powerful in our culture. It's all about doing what you love, finding your true self, expressing yourself, and I don't know if this is freedom. I mean, it's also a lot of pressure. You know, so girls and boys are told to do what you love, follow your passion, and many of them have no idea what their passion is. So, I mean, in that sense, it could be another sort of constraint. I mean, I don't know what the natural state of things is. But I think what's been neglected by people that study this self-expressive value system is the gender component. And the fact that one's understanding of our true self is highly gendered. We see ourselves as male or female with all that that entails culturally. And so when we don't really know what we're going to love or be good at, since gender is such a central axis of our identity, we tend to fall back on gender as a predictor of what we'll love or be good at. And so, yeah, so I think that that is different from societies where one isn't asked to make that choice. Maybe you self-realize in other ways. But you know, making those kinds of choices that lead women into fields where they cannot sustain themselves, like a lot of girls I know, my daughter's friends, they want to be yoga teachers, or they want to do, you know, something that you can't possibly earn a living at in the United States. And so that has a cost. You know, the assumption is that you're not going to have to raise a family or support a family on your own, which is in many cases not true in the United States. A lot of women end up supporting a family on their own. So yeah, I mean, there is a certain attractiveness to following your passions, and you know, some of us are very fortunate and are able to do work that we love, but sometimes that pursuit is risky.
Thank you. Mario had the response.
Yeah, I have two kinds of comments to both your questions and Maria's comment here. I mean, I think, what do we really know about these post-materialist values of young people today? Because I think many of us have the impression that young people today are more career-oriented, more strategic, and very stressed about doing as best as they can in school. And I mean, it appears like a kind of feeling of risk, a new feeling of risk. So yeah, so I don't really know about that. But what I'm I mean, it makes me uncertain on what is going on. But the other thing I would like to say is that, I mean, it's clearly more gender segregated among those who are choosing the vocational occupations and educations than those making higher education choices. So I think that we need different approaches dependent on which level or what types of educations we are talking about. And I think that I may be really naive, but I think there's a great opportunity for changes when it comes to higher education and getting more women into STEM fields and so on. But I think, as we had a little debate on earlier today, I think that if the labor market, the working life, are offering jobs that are impossible to balance with not only a family life, but a meaningful leisure time, you will lose out of the girls who are interested in that kind of jobs and educations. But then when we're talking about vocational education, I mean, it's a lot of things going on when it comes to, and Erling knows a lot about this, but about robotization and technologization and so on of the working life, and which occupations will there be a big need for people in the future, and where will there be a less need for people in the future, and if health and care occupations are among the occupations where there will be a big need, it's really problematic if it's so hard to get young men to think that this is a type of job and career I could choose. Yeah.
So I was thinking about the post-materialistic value system that Maria was mentioning, and I'm wondering. It's a question for you. But what I've heard is that in Norway, with changes in society and the fatherhood chunk of the paid family leave, that there really has been a shift in fathers seeing involved daily caregiving being an important value for them. That really has been an amazing change in Norwegian society. My understanding, and please correct me, but that's occurred across the social class spectrum. And so we can maybe even see that as a value shift, like expanding passion to include involved daily care, done not only by mothers but by fathers. And perhaps that is a step toward imagining oneself in a profession that involves care of children or elders.
Yeah. Well, that's a great transition into my next question, which has to do with boys and men. And so we have been talking most about women and women's choices today, but what I was trying to show in my first little talk was that it's really in the female-dominated fields that the room for change is the biggest, because they make up such a huge part of the Norwegian labor market. So my question to you is sort of, do we need a different set of explanations to explain men's absence from these occupations, or can we sort of use the same knowledge from the studies of women's choices to understand what's going on with the boys?
My answer is usually if you just raise the wages in the female occupation sector, the problem is
solved.
Maybe solved.
Well, that would be the same mechanism, I presume.
That would be the same mechanism. Yeah. But I mean, I'm really interested in other perspectives.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, just one observation that it's not always rational for men to avoid women-dominated occupations. During the recession in the United States, that was one reason for higher unemployment rates among men than women, or because the female-dominated occupations were growing, and the male-dominated occupations are in the shrinking, or tend to be in the shrinking, especially for sort of working class people. And so, you know, I noticed also, Lisa, in your presentation that the male-dominated vocations, the female-dominated vocations are extremely stigmatized for men. And I mean, you didn't talk much about that, but it struck me that, you know, that was a big gender difference. So, you know, men were really neither men nor women were encouraged to go into those fields, probably because they don't pay much. But for men, the effect was like double. And so I think that stigma effect is really powerful, and we see that you know, violating you know, the sort of gender or not doing gender conforming work is much worse for men than for women in terms of the sort of cultural blowback. So,
yeah. Any other comments on this?
Well, I think Maria is right about pay, and maybe this has already been done, but one could do studies across societies. We were just commenting informally at earlier that there are more men in childcare in Norway than in the U.S. And it also, I heard, was especially more common in larger, more institutionalized settings. And those are probably, they probably pay better. And I think that is, if we value this work and we need people to do it and we want men to do it, everyone should be paid more to do it.
But and of course, some of the other things that are done is not to spread the few men in all different kind of departments in a big institution and so on, but concentrate them more so it gets more gender balance, at least in some places where you have both men and women, because of course there's it's a problem often for women to going into more or less totally male-dominated occupations and working settings, and it's the other way around. So so it would be interesting to hear any other types of explanations. For maybe we can just use the ones we have been using.
One thing. So I've talked a little bit about education, and we've had a lot of talk about the labor market. And one puzzle that is not so often sort of discussed in relation to each other is this idea that, or this narrative or fact, that boys are doing worse or underperforming in the educational system, that they are getting lower grades, that are attending higher education to a lower degree than women, and it's been like that for quite some time. But then in the labor market, everything switches, and men are having stronger career patterns and higher pay. So how can we understand this disconnect?
I thought you were going to tell us. I actually think that, I think that's kind of a puzzle that we need to have in mind when this kind of new debate on boys doing more poorly in school than girls, and the possible consequences of this. But I also think that it's important to differentiate between, not all men are successful in the labor market, so there's a lot of variance in the labor market. And also, if we are talking very broadly about men and women in the labor market, it's often said that men are the extreme sex, that they are much more successful and less successful. So we have to have this in mind. But I think also we have to have in mind that this is a debate that also can be used as a counter gender equality debate. So it's a really, I think, quite complicated issue.
We're going to move to questions in a second. I wanted to hear if any of you had any comments on this before we open up for questions.
Well, it seems that the situation is different in Norway than in the U.S. in terms of the gender gap in education. In the U.S., it's you don't really see much gender gap in school performance among sort of privileged kids. It's something that is more found for non-white immigrant people, and the explanations are quite different than I think I would venture to offer here in Norway. But one question I had was how common is it to go to university here and relative to vocational school? What's the difference? I mean,
so currently, just to answer that real quick, I just looked at the numbers yesterday, and it's about 42% of girls and 28% of boys that go to university or higher education.
Oh, so it's a minority.
Yeah.
So in the U.S. it's much higher.
Yeah.
And there isn't a vocational option.
Or there are vocational options in higher,
Yeah.
well, in community colleges.
In some community colleges, but it's, so, you know, people are encouraged to go to university even if they might not, you know, if there were a vocational option track, they might have been tracked into that, or they might have chosen that. So it could be that some of these students who are, you know, underperforming or so-called underperforming at the secondary level are those who already imagine themselves going for a vocational degree. And one other thing I'll say is that I did a study about 20 years ago of the vocational sector in Switzerland, because and also found that the vocational sector is much more segregated. So people who have a vocational degree tend to choose or be in more gender-typed fields after they get their degree. And one suggestion that I made at the time, and I don't know if this is true for Norway, is that the earlier you make a choice, reluctance to transgress gender stereotypes is at its peak during adolescence. There's a lot of social psychological literature that suggests that. So, you know, in Switzerland at least, the decision to take the vocational track occurs sometimes as early as age 12, 14, 15. And so, you know, it's understandable from that perspective why those choices would be extremely gender typed.
Did you have a comment to that, Mary?
No.
Okay.
Let's hear from.
All right, let's hear from the audience. There was one question here.
Yes, Guttorm from Mannsforum. Mari, she asked, what incentives should we use to get a better gender balance in the studies? And I suggest that we try to introduce the same incentives for men or boys coming into universities and study like we use today for women. Because for women today, there are 137 positive incentives to get women into STEM studies, you know, different variants on that, or whether it is male majority. But there is only 3, maybe 4 incentives now given to men who want to go into female-dominated studies. So for a start, you could reduce perhaps some of the ones for women going into STEM, and then increase the one for men going into female-dominated. And maybe you should start with gender studies. Because in Norway, one of the most gender unbalanced studies is gender studies, where there are 90% women and only 10% men, and hardly that. And we saw also in this research, there were 3 times as many women in the research team as there are men. So I think that, you know, it's about time to think gender balance on both sides of the spectrum, and not only where there are male dominance or male majority than female. Perhaps the solution lies in reversing the perspective and look the other way and see, you know, we have to get gender balance for both genders in all sectors.
Thank you. Does anyone want to, Mari, feel?
I agree with Guttorm in that, but I think that it's a little bit more problematic because there's a problem for many of the female-dominated occupations that you need enough applicants, and you need enough qualified applicants to use the same instruments as you that has been used for getting women into male-dominated occupations. But I think there's just been a public commission with an important report on these issues, with I think splendid propositions for measures here to increase the incentives to get boys and girls to make more untraditional choices.
Yeah, I can add that I think that Mari is right about the So I think the main thing you were referring to is gender points that are added so that you get a higher score when you apply for university. So in Norway we don't have any. The only way that you get selected into an educational program is by your grade point average. There's no sort of individual letter or things that you normally use in the United States. But so here it's mainly the grades, and we have some studies that over several years now, where women are in the minority, that they've gotten extra points, gender points basically. And so it sort of can bring them over a threshold to get into for example, several engineering studies and etc. So, of course, it's as Mari was saying, it's a problem if there's no real competition to get in, then it doesn't really help. But it's possible also that it sends a signal that these boys are wanted, regardless of whether it works in practice, whether the points actually help them. But it could send an important signal, anyways.
And I mean, not that it matters, but I'm really for all this.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay,
the next person on my list is Eivind.
Thank you, and thank you for an interesting seminar. Although I must confess that I felt that most of what you told us confirms knowledge that we think we have already. But I would like to ask a question, or two questions, concerning the basis for this research. You have used the Duncan index to describe degree of segregation and rank countries, using both the occupational classification to the 2-digit level and the industry classification, presumably also to a 2-digit level. And my question is, do you know of any studies that have examined the sensitivity of that index and the ranking on the resolution of the occupational and industry classification? When you increase the number of categories from around 30 to 400 or 500, presumably that might have some influence on the outcome.
Yeah.
And I have one question to Erling mainly. There has been very little discussion about how the ranking over time and between countries have been influenced by the socioeconomic situations in the countries. Presumably, low-income countries have, it's the high-class, rich people, parents who can afford to have their girls going to higher secondary education and to higher education, and the choice which they then get on choosing occupations, and it also go for boys. And I would have thought that this would have a significant influence on the ranking according to the Duncan index.
Well, Erling, you're welcome to answer. I can answer part of it, maybe. I'll start, and then I'll give the floor to you. I think that, one thing that Maria has, in her book on occupational ghettos, they do actually compare different measures of indices and they are skeptical about the Duncan Index in that book, which is about 15 years old. We've experimented with different indices, so one of the things I wanted to say is that one of the criticisms of the Duncan Index has to do with whether we're talking about, this is hard to explain really quickly, but it's sensitive to the margins. So it's sensitive basically to the number or the share of women in the labor market, basically. So what we're doing in our study when we're including the homemakers is sort of making an effort to see what that looks like in practice. But we've also decomposed it. Is that what we say in English? Decomposition. Made a decomposition and looked at the change over time in Norway using registry data, and where we look at whether it's structural change or change in the gender balance in the occupations that lowers our segregation over time. And it's clearly the distribution of men and women and not the structural changes that are driving the reduction in segregation over time in Norway. Do you want to add something, Erling?
No, I think you said a lot, but we have experimented with both. So the reason why we use one fineness of definitions is to get comparable data across all the countries, but we have experimented with 3 digits, time 3 digits, and we get very similar results where we have the data. So I don't think that's a big issue. It's always a question of whether the occupational codes are good and they develop over time and things like this. But I don't think that's a big thing. And when it comes to the use of the Duncan Index, we do this trick by including the whole population, or anyone who says they are either working or working at home, in order to solve this problem. So I think that's okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Annelise, you had a question?
First of all, I want to thank you all for very interesting presentations. And the topic of this conference is stability or change. And I think that the really interesting thing is that you have had many examples of change that is going on in Norway. So I think that that's really there's. You have to hold the mic. Sorry. Okay. There are hope for more change in the future. So I have a question about. That I'm wondering about. Maria, you have been arguing that the ideology of choice is very crucial for understanding the continuation of gender essentialism. I wonder if that is the case in Norway. I'm not sure. And if you look at the US and Norway, I think that also we have different policies when it comes to gender equality, and so there are different gender egalitarianisms. And in Norway, we have also had a policy not for only increasing equality of opportunity, but also equality of outcome. And I think that it was referred to the family policy that has increased men's caring role in Norway. And I think that is sort of the part of very important different type of egalitarian policies, where choice is also about the ability to choose away from traditional roles. And I think that has been very, very important in Norway. So I think that maybe also the choice rhetoric in Norway is sort of supporting young women in going into traditional male-dominated occupations. But I think that what we are sort of having, the main problem is that how to get men into female-dominated occupations. But I think that there is a very important dimension here that we haven't talked about, and I think that maybe there are different explanations for men going into female-dominated occupations that have a very low status, and women going into high-status male occupations. And I think that is the issue of class, because I think that this is really touching upon this small exchange earlier today, because I think that maybe there are different views in the what choice you have in the working class versus middle class, because your expectations and your knowledge about different career paths is very different. And maybe, this is a classical sociological topic. The different ways of valuing different career paths, because you have different opportunities to make it, even if you are taking the risk. So I think that might be an explanation why you have a more reproduction of traditional patterns, maybe in working class context.
Thank you. Do you want to respond, Maria, or
Well,
anyone
I
else?
think we agree. The way that you talk about choice is sort of social construct. It's an understanding that we have of when is it that we are making free choices. So I fully agree with you, and I think that it's contextually contingent, and I don't know how it occurs or how it's constructed in the Norwegian context. On average, I would say that there are different types of choices in more affluent societies than in less affluent societies, and even within societies, people who are more privileged or less privileged make different types of choices, but it's always constrained choices. And the other thing I would say is that this choice is also an ideology. It's a way of understanding the world, and it's a very individualistic, sort of liberal Western construct, right? And it's a legitimation for unequal outcomes, because we all sort of own the choices that we make because we are, especially in the United States, we understand choice as an individual thing, as residing deep inside of us. And so when we make a choice, we then will defend it to the end because it's our choice, right? Without sort of maybe seeing the social and cultural factors that played into us making that choice. And so that's why I think gender segregation is so powerful in these contexts, because if you tell a young woman, well, why are you doing that occupation that's so gender stereotyped, and they don't feel that way at all. They feel like they chose that occupation because that's the occupation that is sort of in line with their wishes and true self. So yeah, I think it's very difficult to change these things. But as Mary said, I think the family leave programs that you have that require men to take the leave or lose it, perhaps provide an opportunity for men to develop an identity as caregivers, and perhaps to want to do caring work, right, in the labor force. And maybe we'll see that, and I hope so.
I think we'll have to wrap up now, unfortunately. I wanted to add that I think that one thing that Annelise touched upon is that there might be a more positive valuation of your choices being constrained in the Norwegian society than in the US, with regard to free choice of healthcare, or with regard to everything. There's sort of this idea that it might be good that I cannot choose freely because it's better for the society in some ways. So although that's not for everyone, I think it's more widespread in Norway than it is in the US. I want to give you a chance to add anything if you have any more comments.
I have just one small comment, because when we are talking about, and also this working class perspective on how to get men into women-dominated professions, we've been talking about wages, but of course, if men have internalized more strongly than women that they are going to be economic providers of the family, they need to be offered full-time positions, and that is often hard at least in your starting position in the health sector. So that's also an important element.
Yeah. That's a good final point, I think. Great. Thank you very much. I hope you'll all go home with some new ideas and a lot of inspiration. Back to your own work or your everyday lives. We'll certainly keep on doing research on this topic. Before we go, I want to thank all the presenters. So I have to get up, and you two can also come on stage, please. This is sort of a Nordic gift. It's licorice, or chocolate licorice, I guess. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I also want to thank Hanna for helping to organize this event. Yes. And finally, thanking all of you guys for showing up and participating. It's been really enjoyable for me, at least. I hope you've enjoyed it too. So thank you.